A moment exists that happens to almost every first-time visitor to the Moscow Metro, and it always happens in the same way. They descend the escalator, one of the longest escalators in the world, moving down into the earth at an angle that makes the tunnel feel like a passage into somewhere else completely. And they step off at the bottom, and they look up, and they freeze. Behind them, other passengers continue flowing past, undisturbed. Because for Muscovites, this is just Tuesday, just the commute, just the way the world is. But the visitor has stopped, and they are standing in what appears to be a palace. And they are trying to reconcile this with the fact that they are underground, and they are about to get on a train. Understanding how this happened, how a system of underground train stations became an art project of astonishing ambition and lasting power, requires understanding what the Soviet government believed art was for, and what the workers who rode these trains every day were supposed to feel when they rode them. And the remarkable thing that happens when you put the greatest artists of a generation to work on a problem and tell them the ceiling of the world is their canvas. The Moscow Metro was conceived in the early 1930s as a political act as much as a transportation solution. Stalin's government understood, with an instinct that ran deeper than policy, that the built environment was ideology made physical. That the spaces people moved through every day shaped how they thought about themselves, about their country, and about what type of future they were building together. The agitprop trains that had carried revolutionary imagery across Russia in the 1920s were a temporary measure, a mobile message. The metro was permanent. The metro was where millions of ordinary Muscovites would spend hours of their lives every year, and those hours were an opportunity. The directive that shaped the architecture came from the Tsar Kaganovich, the party official who oversaw the project, and it has become one of the defining statements of Soviet aesthetic philosophy. The stations should be palaces for the people. This phrase deserves to be sat with, because it contains a real tension and a real aspiration that shaped everything that followed. In pre-revolutionary Russia, palaces were where the aristocracy lived, where power expressed itself in gold leaf and marble and frescoed ceilings, where the accumulated wealth of a ruling class became visible in stone and paint and light. The Soviet project proposed to take all of that, the grandeur, the beauty, the declaration of significance, and give it to the workers who had always been kept outside. The subway station was the palace that belonged to everyone. Every day, on the way to work, the ordinary Soviet citizen would pass through spaces of remarkable beauty. And the message was inescapable. This is yours. You built this. You deserve this.
The first line of the Moscow Metro opened on May 15, 1935, and the 13 stations that formed it announced, immediately and unambiguously, what type of project this was going to be.
Sokolniki Station, at the eastern end of the first line, set the template that would influence Soviet metro design for decades. The platform hall was long and vaulted, its ceiling divided into panels by cream-coloured ribs, with pendant light fixtures arranged in a rhythm that pulled the eye along the length of the space. The effect was of a processional hall, a space designed for ceremonial passage as much as transit, the daily journey rendered as a form of civic ritual. You were beyond waiting for a train. You were participating in a civic ritual. The architects working on these first stations were operating under conditions that were, to put it plainly, terrifying. The Soviet state in the 1930s was simultaneously capable of providing artists with vast resources and wide creative freedom to do their best work, and of sending those same artists to labour camps if the work fell short of expectation. The records of the design process for the early metro stations show teams of architects and artists working with intense focus, debating every detail, revising endlessly, beyond perfectionism alone, but out of an awareness that the stakes were truly existential. What came out of this pressure was, paradoxically, some of the finest work any of them ever produced.
The underground is sacred space. The deeper you go, the more the metro begins to feel like a church.
When you arrive at the bottom of the deepest stations, the ones built in the late 1930s and through the war years, the sensation is far from a public transit facility, but of a nave. The vaulted ceiling recedes. The light comes from below and above and falls across surfaces that glow over merely reflecting. The human voices of the crowd are absorbed into the stone, and the space holds a particular quality of quiet underneath the noise. The quality that old churches have. The accumulated hush of many people arriving somewhere, and involuntarily lowering their voices. This was intentional, and it was also a thing the architects lacked the freedom to say out loud, because the Soviet state was officially and aggressively atheist, and the church was the enemy, and any suggestion that a people's palace was drawing on the visual logic of religious architecture would have been dangerous. So they drew on it anyway. The artists commissioned to cover these walls and ceilings with mosaic were people who had grown up inside Russian Orthodox visual culture, who had stood as children beneath the golden domes of churches and felt the particular pressure that a ceiling full of saints exerts on the human being below it. The sense of being seen, of being held inside a larger story, of existing inside a space meant for you and also far beyond you. They brought all of that feeling underground. They replaced the saints with workers. They replaced the theological program with the historical one, but the grammar of the experience, the way the space asks you to look up, the way the gold catches the light and turns the ceiling luminous from within, the way the image above you suggests a world larger than the one you are standing in. All of that came from somewhere, and everyone in those vaulted halls could feel where it came from, and it went unsaid. What the Soviet underground built was a system of secular cathedrals for a population that had been told it had outgrown the need for cathedrals. The need had simply gone underground.
There is a station in Moscow where the ceiling is a window into a sky the room has zero business containing.
You are 60 meters underground. Above you, the earth. Above the earth, the city. Above the city, presumably, the actual sky. And yet, standing on the platform and looking up at the oval panels in the vaulted ceiling, each one filled with a different image of Soviet life seen from above. A parachutist falling. A pilot at the controls of a biplane. A harvest field seen from the air. Athletes running on a track below. You feel a vertigo that is completely real. The ceiling opens. The light catches the mosaic tiles at angles that shift as you move, so the images seem to flicker and breathe. The figures are painted from below, their bodies foreshortened in the way a body looks when you are lying on the ground and someone is standing over you. And you are, in a sense, lying on the ground, or standing below an artificial sky, and the bodies are above you, moving through light. The man who designed these panels was one of the great painters of his generation, and he was working at a moment in his life when the tension between what he believed and what he was permitted to express had reached a type of crisis. He had been a true revolutionary in his youth, had felt the new Soviet project as an aesthetic liberation as much as a political one, had thrown himself into making images that celebrated the speed and the vitality and the physicality of the new world. His paintings of athletes and swimmers have a quality of pure joy in the human body that is almost embarrassing in its directness. He painted people the way people look in the best moments of physical effort, which is to say, they look lit from within. By the time he was commissioned to design the ceiling panels for what would become Mayakovskaya Station, the political climate had contracted, and he was navigating it the way all Soviet artists navigated it. Carefully, with constant awareness of the line between what was permitted and what had been forbidden. The Metro Commission offered him a rare gift, a formal problem that was so demanding and so clearly defined that he could dissolve into it completely, could set aside the politics and start thinking about the ceiling. How do you fill an oval panel 6 meters overhead? How do you make a foreshortened figure in mosaic read from 30 feet below? How do you create the feeling of sky inside a sealed room of stone and steel. His solution was to trust the physics of the situation and refuse to fight them. He painted the sky as it looks from below, which is to say as depth and light more than as space, as the quality of being up there over the mere fact of it. The bodies in his panels face outward and upward, away from the viewer, giving the impression that the figures carry the weight of presences over illustrations, inhabiting a sky that the ceiling has become. People who know his work on canvas recognize in these panels the same intensity, the same love of the body at the precise moment of maximum aliveness. He made the ceiling of an underground station into the best work of his life. He stood on the platform sometimes, years later, and looked up at it, and the people who saw him there recognized a man in private conversation with the only version of his full self that the state had permitted to exist in public.
The Bronze Dogs and the Ritual of Hope. At one of the older stations, the art has been altered by the people who use it, and the alteration has made it more true.
The platform is lined with bronze figures installed into arched niches in the walls. Soldiers, sailors, workers, farmers, the full cast of the Soviet human ideal, their bodies crouching and kneeling because the architecture demanded it, the low arches forcing each figure into a compressed posture that reads, whatever the sculptor intended, as the posture of effort over triumph. The Soviet heroes look like they are working hard. They look like the people they were modelled on, tired, holding on, doing the thing that needs to be done. The state commissioned images of radiant Soviet strength, and the architecture collaborated with the sculptor to produce images of ordinary human endurance. This was accidental and also perfect. Several of the figures extend arms toward the platform, holding objects. A rifle, a book, a rooster, a leash with a dog at the end of it. At some point in the decades after the station opened, people began to touch the dog's nose. The reasoning was the type of reasoning that folklore always invents for itself. It brings good luck, someone said. And the rumour travelled the way true rumours travel, from person to person through a city of 10 million people who needed luck and were willing to reach for it.
The dog's nose is now gold.
Polished smooth and warm by 80 years of daily contact, it glows against the darkened patina of the rest of the bronze, with a colour that the sculptor left unintended, and that is more beautiful than anything he did intend. The figure is a piece of Soviet propaganda that has become a folk shrine through the accumulated superstition of millions of ordinary people going about their days. You see people touch it on their way through, free of breaking stride, the hand extending and grazing the metal in a gesture so habitual it has gone below conscious, the body doing what it does at this particular column, on this particular platform, the mind already somewhere else. The student on the way to an exam, the traveller catching a connection, the grandmother because her grandmother told her to. This is what happens to art when you let people live with it long enough. It absorbs the life of the people around it and becomes a vessel the artist left unmade. A container for the daily, inarticulate hopes of a city. The state commissioned bronze to celebrate ideology. 8 decades of Muscovites quietly converted it to an older and more personal thing. The nose of the dog shines every day, in a subway station, like a small answered prayer.
What happens when the party decides? Beauty is wasteful. For 2 decades, the Soviet Union built the most beautiful subway system in the world. Then, in the mid-1950s, it stopped.
The man who stopped it was Nikita Khrushchev, who had come to power after Stalin's death, and who had looked at the ornate stations of the Moscow metro and seen, with the practical eye of a man who had spent years worrying about housing shortages and production quotas, an enormous waste of marble and gold leaf and skilled labour that could have been building apartment blocks for workers. He gave a speech. The speech was about architecture, but it was really about a particular Soviet fantasy coming to an end. The fantasy that grandeur was the same as respect, that putting workers inside palaces was the same as treating them well. The stations built after his directive were clean and functional and free of interest. Ceramic tile replaced marble. Fluorescent lights replaced chandeliers. The architecture became the architecture of efficiency, which is the architecture of saying, This space is for transit. Transit is what you do here. The space asks zero questions about you as anything other than a person who needs to get from one place to another. Walk through one of these later stations and then walk into one of the old ones and feel the difference in what the space is asking of you. The old stations ask you to be someone who deserves to be in a beautiful room. The new ones ask you to keep moving. What Khrushchev had correctly identified was that the metro as palace was a form of propaganda. What he had missed was that it was also, separately, beautiful, and that beauty differs from propaganda even when propaganda deploys it, and that the workers commuting through these stations every day were receiving a real thing from the experience, regardless of the ideological intent behind it. You can use beauty as a lie, and the beauty holds. Dismantling the lie leaves the beauty behind. It just produces a subway.
The old stations remain. They are, if anything, more vivid for contrast, where Islamic stars met Soviet cosmonauts.
The Soviet Union was an empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the borders of China. And when it extended its metro systems to the capitals of the Union republics, a remarkable thing happened at the edges of the empire that bypassed the center. In the cities of Central Asia, Tashkent, Baku, the cities of the Caucasus, the artists commissioned to decorate the metro stations were people who had grown up inside visual traditions that shared zero overlap with the Moscow mainstream. Islamic ornamental art, one of the most sophisticated decorative traditions in the world, had spent centuries developing a visual language based on geometry and repetition and infinite extension. Intricate patterns that could tile a surface free of end, star forms and arabesques that the eye follows deeper and deeper, free of any terminating point. It was a tradition that had developed partly because figurative representation was discouraged in religious contexts, which had pushed centuries of artistic energy into form over imagery, into the mathematics of pattern over the depiction of the world. The results were one of humanity's great achievements in visual thinking, and they were largely invisible from Moscow. When the metro commissions came, the local artists incorporated what they knew. A station dedicated to Soviet cosmonauts was decorated with the star patterns of medieval Islamic astronomy. A station celebrating Soviet workers was surfaced in the geometric language of Uzbek tilework, the same logic that covers the domes of Samarkand's great medieval buildings, now running across the walls of a transit hall, framing photographs of smiling collective farm workers. The collision between the two visual systems was electric, precisely because they were so incompatible in origin and so formally suited to each other. Soviet socialist realism needed flat surfaces covered in images of heroic labor. Islamic geometric art was the most refined tradition in the world for covering flat surfaces beautifully. They met in the underground of Tashkent and produced a third thing neither tradition could have imagined. In Armenia, the story ran differently because the tradition was different. The Armenian metro stations drew on a Christian visual vocabulary that was more than 1,000 years old. The stone-carved ornaments of the Khachkar crosses that stand in Armenian churchyards across the Caucasus, their interlaced patterns encoding a theology in geometric form. These patterns were officially secularized for the metro commissions, officially stripped of their religious meaning and presented as cultural heritage over active faith. But the stone carvers who translated them onto the station walls were people who had learned their craft from that tradition from the inside. People whose understanding of the forms included the meaning. What they put into the walls is there in its full complexity, available to anyone who can read it, waiting quietly under its secular cover story, in a transit station that has been open for 50 years.
Art does this when it is forced to survive. It goes into the pattern. The city that built a different, the type of palace. Moscow was extravagant. St. Petersburg was exact.
The metro built under the northern city, Leningrad, as it was called through most of the Soviet period, developed its own visual identity, colder and more austere, and in its way more severe than Moscow's, shaped by a city that had spent 200 years setting a standard for how grandeur was supposed to look. St. Petersburg was a city of classical facades and stone embankments and long perspectives across water. A city where the inherited weight of European architecture lay across every new building and asked it to justify itself. The ornamental enthusiasm of the Moscow Metro would have read, in this context, as provincial excess. The Leningrad designers understood this and went the other direction. The result was stations built on restraint, where the grandeur came from proportion and precision over accumulation, where a single material used perfectly carried more weight than a dozen materials used lavishly. The most celebrated of these stations used columns as its central architectural gesture, and then did a remarkable thing to those columns. Half of them were faced in conventional plaster ornament, classical motifs stripped to their geometric essence. The other half were made of glass. Structural columns in the load-bearing sense, but surfaced in thick pressed glass that had been moulded into bas-relief panels, so that the overhead light failed to fall on the columns from outside, but seemed to enter the glass and live there, emanating outward. The column appeared to generate its own illumination. In a station 60 metres underground, where the quality of light is completely artificial, an architect had managed to create the impression of a material that was made of light. This was, in a way, a translation. St. Petersburg is a city famous for the quality of its light. The long northern light of late summer evenings that falls across the painted facades and the water at an angle that makes the city look as though it is lit from within. The architects of the Leningrad Metro had grown up inside that light. They had internalized it, had understood it as the defining visual quality of the place they were working in. And when they went underground, they found a way to recreate it in glass and electricity 60 metres below the surface. Walk through that station and you are, in some precise technical sense, inside St. Petersburg. Alexander Deniker, who designed the mosaic ceiling of Mayakovskaya, was one of the most gifted artists of his generation, a painter whose work combined the formal innovations of the Soviet avant-garde with a deep love of the human figure in motion, of athletes and workers and flyers and swimmers, rendered with a clarity and dynamism that made his paintings feel like the visual equivalent of Whitman's "I Sing the Body Electric." He had been a committed communist in his youth, a true believer, and his relationship with the Soviet state was the relationship of an artist who shared its ideals while chafing against its demands. His career traced the arc of Soviet cultural policy across 5 decades, the creative freedom of the 1920s, the narrowing of the 1930s under socialist realism, the relative loosening of the post-war period, the increasing conservatism of the late Stalin years. The Metro Commission gave him a space, literally a vault of ceiling 60 metres underground, in which to produce work that transcended the ideological constraints he navigated above ground. And he used that space fully. Pavel Korin, whose stained glass and mosaics define the visual experience of Novoslobodskaya and Komsomolskaya Circle, was a more enigmatic figure. He had studied icon painting as a young man and had been a pupil of Mikhail Nesterov, one of the last great painters in the Russian religious tradition. His enormous, unfinished canvas Requiem, begun in the 1930s and worked on until his death, depicted the procession of the old Russian Orthodox Church in its final moments, a painting that would have been politically impossible to exhibit in the Soviet Union, but that Korin worked on anyway, in private, as an act of faith and memory. The spiritual intensity that he lacked the freedom to put into painting publicly went into the mosaics and stained glass of the metro stations, where it survived under the protective cover of Soviet content. His images of Soviet citizens look unmistakably like icons, and the visual kinship is completely deliberate. Vera Makina, who designed the worker and Kolkhoz woman statue that became the logo of Mosfilm, contributed decorative programs to several metro stations. Tatiana Mavrina, who would later become one of the great illustrators of Russian folktales, worked on mosaic designs for station platforms. The sculptor Matvey Maniza produced figures for Ploshchad Revolutsy station, whose formal quality was considered remarkable enough that when the bronze originals were temporarily removed during the Second World War, the moulds were preserved with extreme care. The Metro drew the best available talent, and the best available talent, whatever their private feelings about the state that employed them, rose to what they clearly recognised as a significant occasion.